Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Dave Sinko, and I imagine if you, like me, love looking at the notes that come with the record, you would have seen Dave's name crop up in many places. He's one of the most respected sound engineers in Nashville, but also one of the most respected live engineers, and I'm really keen to talk about both the recording side and the live side of things. Dave, welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along.
Thank you, Matt. My pleasure to be here.
It's really cool to have you here. I've been looking forward to this. There are so many things I'd love to talk about in terms of the people you've worked with and the projects you've worked on, but I'd love to start just with getting a sense of how you got into the sort of the more engineering side of audio, because I know you were a musician originally, and I think I read somewhere that you started out essentially doing live sound for the bands you were in.
Yes, to a certain extent. I was in a band back in the late 70s, and was we played little clubs. We started in Florida and moved up. We all moved up to Atlanta and played at little bars in Atlanta. And I don't much count that as even being a player. I've never really been much of a player. I knew some chords and a little bit. I've learned so much more about music since I became an engineer, or a recordist, as I like to say, because I don't have an engineering degree.
So how did you sort of make that transition then into working on the sort of the recordist side of things?
Well, I was always interested in that. Even back then, I had a recorder at home, and I was doing track to track bouncing, and then once the original tracks lost too much fidelity, I would re-record them on a later layer and did that and that kind of thing. I was always interested in that. And I did run sound for that little trio, but later on, I worked in building racing yachts in Florida, and I sort of transitioned out of doing horrible fiberglass work into working with wood. And I started building mandolins, of all things. And knowing what an instrument should sound like is a great place to start in recording. And I came into the recording part after working and building instruments. So I was very much into the subtleties of tone and carving tops and backs for mandolins and tap tuning them, identifying notes by ear, which is like really great training for mixing and even live sound. Identifying notes is always important. Yeah,
and I guess sort of that whole tap tuning thing, I mean, that's a fascinating world in itself, but just it's all about vibration, isn't it? And understanding how that works in all different contexts and how vibrations interact with the world around them, the material that they're traveling through, and then the ears they go into. It's a whole kind of fascinating world, isn't it?
Well, and in mixing, it's like everything we do is relative to what we hear. You hear it on a set of speakers, and you make decisions on things to change, judging it by what you're hearing from the speakers. So it makes knowing what's coming out of your speakers really important.
And that's a really interesting thing in terms of the way the world of music has changed in the last few decades. Because, I work for a tech company, and when you design a website, you can design a different version of it for a big screen as you would for a mobile phone, but you end up doing one mix largely for an album that's going to come out of all sorts of different speakers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. iPhone playback is still one of my tests for final mix. It's just as telling as anything else, especially holding the phone in vertical mode so it's in mono is very informative, really, in a lot of ways. And truly, again, you get back to it's all about knowing what you're hearing. that's how mastering guys do their jobs. They know exactly what their playback system is producing so that they can make judgments on what they're hearing relative to that. It's all about relativity. If you don't have that relativity, you're guessing. Now, if you translate that into live sound, there's such a wild variety of what speaker systems sound like in rooms it changes with how it's installed and how it's set up and just geographically where the speakers are hanging from and what's near them. And then it gets down to the guy who's setting up the system and controlling the software that controls every aspect of how that speaker system works. And even with all the modern test equipment like SMART and everything else that they're doing with sound systems these days, which is kind of amazing and really astounding what it can do, at the end of it all, it still gets down to a subjective call of somebody sitting in the room and listening to something and going like, oh no, I'm going to change that. Well, that needs to be like a lot brighter. And then another person will come in and go like, that is so painfully bright, I can't stand it, which is usually me.
And my limited experience of kind of mixing anything in a studio or in a live situation is like there's always something to tinker with as well. Like everything you changes everything else, and you can end up never stopping, can't you?
House of cards.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a house of cards. Although, the longer I do this, the less I backtrack. I like setting relationships in a mix, and I really try to hang on to those until something starts happening that disrupts that. And then I know that I need to change that instead of the thing I've already made a decision on. I find myself hanging on to those first relationships that I set up. And some of that, like different tunes can start different ways where you figure out what's relating to what, and I love getting that set and then altering everything else that frames that. Oftentimes the vocal is what needs framing.
Yeah. And well, that's interesting because we can maybe come on to this in time, but just my association with it, and this may be distorted by the kind of music I listen to and so my reference, but my association with what you do is kind of very much a specialization in acoustic music and in string band music. And sometimes that is entirely instrumental and there is no vocal. But I mean, I would just sort of quickly backtrack on myself there because most of the music I associate you with is in that string band tradition somewhere, but I'm aware you've done stuff beyond that too. Did you end up sort of intending to operate largely in an acoustic space, or is that just where you ended up?
I just loved it. I just loved it. I love acoustic music, and from the physics of how the sound is produced to amplifying it in spaces and recording it and mixing it. It's where my nose led me, because I started in country music. My first big live sound gig was with Don Williams, old country singer. And I've stayed with Don for about 7 years. And after I quit doing live sound for Don, I was working more in the studio, and I recorded probably 6 more records with Don after that. And he's actually the one that taught me that term framing stuff in the mix, cool, referring to his vocal.
Yeah.
You can hear that on some of the old Don Williams. Do you ever listen to like old country music?
Yeah. And I mean, his voice as well is such a thing, isn't it? It's it can fill a frame. It's an easy thing to put at the center of a song.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's one way. That's like one way to do it. And being able to learn from someone like Don Williams to me was like just invaluable. His sense of what should be happening in a mix was very insightful.
There's a wonderful live recording from the Albert Hall where.
Oh yeah.
What's the song he's singing? Is it "You're My Best Friend"? And the audience basically take over. And this, English people are not known for public displays of emotion and outpourings of, but like just this, it starts off quite quietly and then gradually the room sort of takes over and he steps back from it and your ears kind of go with it.
I mean, when I was with Don, we would go to the UK for about a month every year. Every spring we'd go to UK, and people were uncharacteristically demonstrative to Don, and people showing up to the Don Williams concerts were wearing cowboy outfits and toy guns and cowboy hats and stuff, which was sweet, you know. Maybe a little goofy, but but that's okay.
Well intentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And that Don Williams record is one that I'm like really proud of. My friend Dave Pomeroy and I produced that with Don, and it was a big deal. We recorded Royal Albert Hall and a Leisure Center in Bournemouth.
Right.
Concert hall there, and St. David Hall in
Cardiff. Is that in Cardiff?
Cardiff. Yeah, it was in Cardiff. Exactly. Thank you.
And that's interesting because they're very different spaces. Like the Albert Hall is, it's a beautiful space, but it's acoustically an odd one, isn't it? They've got all those sort of mushrooms hanging from the ceiling just to try and, the sound can go up to the ceiling and just hang around there for a bit, can't it?
Yeah, I loved Albert Hall. It sounded so good in there, though. It sounded pretty much all the ballads on that record came from Albert Hall. The up-tempo ones came from, it was about a third, I think, from each place. And I think the most up-tempo ones came from the smallest room, which is telling in itself, isn't it?
That's interesting. The slow songs work best, and it makes total sense. My sister-in-law was an opera singer, and she says she loves singing in cathedrals because you basically start and finish the note, and the room does the rest of the work for you.
Yeah, exactly. Which is true of every space, really. It's just about how long it's involved, and Albert Hall is involved for a fairly long time. It has a kind of a long reverb tail that was kind of great. Really, it was really, really good. I loved mixing in there, and I was recording that record from out in the middle of the floor. I actually rented a digital multitrack and had it delivered to Albert Hall and brought a whole pile of preamps with me to record that. And it was challenging.
Well, how do you set up for something like that? Because in my head, I was thinking, we'll talk about live sound and we'll talk about recorded sound, but obviously here's an instance where both are happening at the same time. And like, how do you set a recorded sound and a live sound in a massive empty room that later has got like 5,000 odd people in it?
Right. Well, there's a whole string of like good guesswork that goes on there. And we decided early on that I've been mixing Don's sound live in a lot of rooms and sort of understood how that needed to translate to the room. And truly that part has to be pretty well set before you can start really thinking about the recording, because it can directly affect the recording. The sound from the speakers is literally going right back into the microphones to a certain degree, at least, you know. And we decided early on we were going to keep it all one thing. The live sound and the recording were going to happen in the same place, not in a separate room. The standard way to do that is with a recording truck where you pull it up outside and there's an engineer outside and he's taking all the lines from the stage and recording them and being able to check each one of those from the truck. And we did all from the floor, the recording and the live sound all happening at once. Wow. Actually, it hit the recorder before it got to the console that sent it to the room, so that the sound of the chain itself would be incorporated in the live sound if there was any change there.
Well, lots of moving parts going on there then.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I had a trunk with 10 14-inch reels of digital tape, which was, imagine that. Checked that, and it was probably easily 100 pounds of tape. Yeah.
Wow.
And we put that on an airplane. That was in the days where we would do a fly date and check everything, instruments in flight cases, which are the weight restrictions nowadays that would never happen. Never. And we were checking things like congas. Congas in a flight case that had 2 electric basses in it. Yeah, crazy. Don's stool, which would fold up into a box. That was another checked item. Imagine doing that these days. Even basses are difficult these days, like upright bass. Paul Coert, who is my landlord here, actually. He's the Punch Brothers bassist.
Yeah.
And he's, it's a constant problem now. His latest bass has a removable neck. It's not a fold-up bass, but the neck comes off, and then and even that is problematic sometimes in checking it. It can be, if there's one person sniggling about 2 pounds, it doesn't get on, and you got to figure out how to get 2 pounds out of it. Like the end pin goes in his backpack or whatever. Boy, I really got off subject there. Sorry.
No, it's fascinating. I remember reading an interview with Julian Lage recently, who said that when he travels with a Telecaster now, he unbolts the neck, puts the body in a backpack to take on with him, and puts the neck in an architect's plans tube.
Wow.
And then just puts it back together when he gets to the venue. But you can't do that with a D28 or a,
no
tone banjo.
Oh, no. And some parts of the world, like traveling with a pre-war D28, the rosewood is an issue now too. So yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
And I think in terms of live sound, the sort of the thing I go to first, I think partly just because it's something you've been doing for years, but also because I'm a huge fan of them, is the sort of the live sound you've been doing for Punch Brothers for a long time now. And that's, I think I've seen Punch Brothers here in the UK every time they've been, apart from once. And the first time was, in Bush Hall, which is a lovely space, a beautiful space. But the second time was in a West End theatre. Then it's been at different size halls at the South Bank. One of them was in a rock club, and they're all totally different acoustic spaces for this music that is like very intimate and a very sort of chamber quality to it. Like some of those spaces, it was made to be played in those spaces, and and it feels like they've done the pickup thing with mics. They've done a 2 mic setup. It's constantly evolving thing, and I find that fascinating. Just how you approach that. We'll be right back with you just after this. Collings Guitars has been a long-time supporter of the bluegrass community, from collaborating with artists to sponsoring festivals big and small, and now by sponsoring Bluegrass Jam Along. Handmade in Austin, Texas, every Collings guitar and mandolin that leaves the shop is built from the sound up, and the team loves seeing a Collings in the hands of players of all levels, from local musicians to world-renowned pickers. Visit collingsguitars.com for more. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
Well, really, it's that whole thing is driven by Chris Thiele, and of course the rest of the band too, in figuring out what we're doing, and a lot of that we figured out together, and it's been a lot of years of building ways to mount stuff on instruments and figuring out system that early on. I think Bush Hall was our little travel system that I built and put in 6 Pelican cases, which we would ship by ground ahead of us to the 2 venues. Especially when we were flying somewhere, like the week before, I would send all the gear out, and we'd put it all together on site. And at that time we were doing, I believe it was probably mics and pickups. So we had a clip-on mic and a pickup on every instrument, and we had it was a really slick system too. We had a way they could switch on stage to a completely separate input on this little bitty analog console, and that would mute it everywhere but their ears. So, and this was just this little stack of one case and a little mixer stand for this. So it was a little 16-channel mixer, and so they could mute themselves and tune and still hear it, and then switch themselves back on. That almost always worked.
There's a lot of tuning goes on.
Well, the bad part is they could forget to unmute or forget to switch themselves back, and they would still hear themselves, but I wouldn't have it.
Well, particularly that first tour, kind of doing something like The Blind Leading the Blind on stage for the first time, when I don't think the record was even out at that point. I think,
is that Bush Hall?
Yeah, I think so. Like 2008, maybe the record was in my head. The record maybe wasn't even out at that point.
That's possible. Because I'm trying to think. The first time we played it over there, I could be wrong about this, I think was what made it into that film, that documentary film.
Yeah.
And we were playing the Haymarket in Glasgow, and they were getting heckled for playing Blind Leading the Blind. Somebody hollered, like, do you play any real music?
Well, I've seen that film, and I wonder, because obviously stuff is edited, but it feels like they were in a cab on the way to the Bush Hall show talking about, do we play the whole thing? Do we chop it up? What do we do? How do we, my memory of it was that you went down a treat. It was like a great reception to it in London, and it was an extraordinary thing to witness. And it must be a very interesting, because Punch Brothers have had various sounds over there. You think of a string band as sounding like a string band, but the subtleties and the nuances of how that's changed over those tours. Like there was one tour, I think it was Phosphorescent Blues tour, when Gabe played some drums. There was, some stuff around one mic. There's been a lot of variety to what feels like a very simple sound.
Yeah. Yeah, the Phosphorescent Blues record was different, and with all the effects that were used on it, and we made a real effort. That's when we switched from like all microphones to pickups and mics for that record, and we actually went in rented rehearsal room, and tried different effects. We tried the actual the old analog effect that was used on the record, and then tried it with an emulator, it was a Line 6 M9, I believe, that had emulators of all the same effects that were used on the record. And when it got down to like using it with a microphone, and since the effects were driven by the pickup, basically, we found that overall the emulator actually worked better. Because we could tailor it to work with the microphone, and even so, I have my doubts as to how effective it was doing that. It was fun. It was definitely a fun exercise. It was a lot of effort to make that happen, though. And then what? A few years later, we were down to doing the single mic thing, which is actually 3 inputs. It's the Neumann U89 as the main microphone in a wide cardioid pattern, because the banjo and the fiddle were almost 90 degrees off the mic. And in that wide pattern, it picks them up better. And then the bass always had 2 inputs, the mic and the pickup, which is what we did from basically the very beginning. to get an acoustic bass sounding good anywhere with a big sound system, it's best with a microphone and a pickup. By the time you get a bass mic loud enough to work, it's a room mic.
Yeah, yeah.
No, truly,
I was going to ask you about that, about what the challenges are with the different instruments, because you've got, a mandolin, which is a very bright, trebly, probably quite focused sound, all the way down to like a bass, as you say, which is, and obviously treble and bass frequencies work in very different ways. One's very directional and one isn't. And if there are particular challenges around the different instruments in a string band.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Again, it depends on how you're approaching it. And there's a lot of other factors like how loud you want to be in a room, too. Because if loudness is not the objective, one mic works everywhere. And it's like perfectly democratic. As long as you find something that's picking up the right area and the band doing the right dance in front of the microphone to ensure the mix, which Punch Brothers is probably one of the best groups ever to do that. Del McCoury Band is like pretty high up there on the list too. It would be maybe a toss-up. Yeah, but it's problematic. I mean, turning a microphone up around big speakers is always problematic, always, because it starts devolving into things like how far you are from it. Is there any separation between the stage and the room? So many of these places have the speakers literally hanging right over the top of the stage, so that even the older line arrays are completely omni down at 100 cycles. So all that is spilling right onto the stage, and you have to deal with all that spillage going back into the microphone, and it basically there's a feedback loop going all the time. And then you get into the musical aspects of it too, where the sound system is 40 feet from the band, which equates to about 40 milliseconds of time, which is musically really late. On the low frequency stuff, it's so difficult for bass players, acoustic bass players in particular, to get the timing right, because they're hearing the sound system back late, which is kind of why you see Punch Brothers, when they do the one mic thing, they're clustered so close together, not only for the mix, but also so they can hear each other, because we do that without monitors also.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting developments of on-stage sound is like in-ear monitors versus just having wedges everywhere, because, it's much easier to control individual mixes, but it's also much easier to keep a quiet stage, which with acoustic instruments can be, a wonderful thing.
In terms of turning stuff up in the room, yeah, it's great. But you know what? People's pitch is never better on IEMs.
Really?
They have to learn to sing in tune. I think IEMs are a really efficient tool, and we did them for a while and still do them sometimes. There was talk of it we're doing only 3 Punch Brothers shows this year, 2 warm-up shows and then the Telluride Bluegrass Festival. But I'm sort of working on what's going to happen there. There was some suggestions of using ears with a single mic and clip-ons. So yeah, last year we did that festival with a single U89 and wireless clip-ons on all the instruments, which I thought I was going to hate that. I didn't. It was actually really good. And I've since mixed that performance for a film they're working on about Telluride Bluegrass Festival. So we'll see if anything ever happens with that. But circling back, doing acoustic music anywhere with a sound system is hard. Bush Hall, I have have great memories of Bush Hall where it was fun, but that's a really challenging room for acoustic music.
I can imagine.
Really bouncy, especially getting the sound with the room empty, which is like always an issue. I think you asked something about that earlier on. Compensating for an empty room, like Albert Hall is what you mentioned, where it's going to fill up with a lot of people and it literally changes the sound of the room by a lot. And that gets into, after you've mixed hundreds of rooms, literally, you start getting a feel for the amount of change that happens when you get all those people in. And people say like, oh, they're big bags of water. You could just bring in 1,000 bags of water and it would do the same thing. And I disagree with that. I think people are resonant. And
well, we are. That's how we sing, right? We've got resonant chambers in us.
I found this funny, like a master thesis of someone at a college, and I don't know how I was just looking for body resonance is what I was searching for, and he had this whole article about body resonance and made this really silly looking chart with some kind of electronic drawing program, but showing the resonance of different parts of the body. And it's like arms and legs are like super low resonance, like super low frequencies, like 5 to 10 hertz. But your torso is between 50 and 100. It's like, whoa, well, that's business range, right? That's right in there. And I believe that a room full of people resonate between 50 and 100 cycles in a really great way. And in some rooms, it actually brings the lower octave up, and other rooms it can kill it.
So you're now going to start testing the resonance of individual audience members before you let them in.
Exactly right. Yes,
tune your audience.
Yeah, you're 80.
You stand at the back.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, let's not go there. No, it's generally. I'll say this: every room sounds better with people in it. Every single one.
It's funny because my experience of that is from sort of performing on a stage, and like the sound you get at a sound check is not the sound you get coming back from the room when the room's full, and you just have to trust that it's going to be all right when everybody's in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you do get used to what you need to prepare for, because like a lot of times the sound system will lose about average, say 5 dB, easily 5 dB of apparent loudness. It's all still set at the same level. All the gains and everything are exactly the same as you left them at sound check. And you hit the downbeat and go like, oh, I need to turn this up, because the audience is soaking up a lot of the power of the speaker system. And 4 to 5 dB is not unusual. Almost most rooms, unless they're really big rooms and there's a lot of air volume compared to the volume of bodies, 4 to 5 dB louder is really common. Really common.
The other thing I was going to ask you about, we talked a bit about Punch Brothers, but the other sort of long-standing collaboration of yours that I'm really interested in is the record you've done with Edgar Meyer. And various combinations. So I think some of those included the records with Chris Thile. And there's something...
says Meyer, by the way.
Edgar Meyer, sorry. Mm-hmm. And there's something fascinating about, and there's a definite crossover between Punch Brothers and some of those records like Appalachia Waltz or Uncommon Ritual, where there is a sort of chamber-like quality to the music that's being made, and a sort of they exist in the space between traditional string band music and classical music, I guess.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether there's any difference in the approach to recording something like that from just recording a string band playing straight ahead bluegrass, if the approach differs at all.
It can. I mean, I've not done a lot of like full on classical recording. I've been around it and was I went with Edgar up to Worcester, Mass, when he recorded the Bach cello suites, and was not doing any recording. I was just there as sort of like Edgar's assistant. I ended up finding noisy exit signs and pulling the lamps out of them so they wouldn't buzz. So there's less buzz on that record because of my efforts, which is funny. But no, I'd say they're not that different. Appalachia Waltz was done in a studio here in Nashville, Sound Emporium studio, where I ended up working for a long time, in a very dry room. So the reverb on that record is very artificial. You compare that to even Uncommon Ritual, which was in a different studio here in Nashville, but a big open church-sized space. At least half of it was. The other half was a chapel also here in town. And say Short Trip Home, which was in a recital hall in Purchase, New York, part of a University of New York. And that was, a lot of that room sound is natural. Oh, so when you get down to just like placing microphones on things, it's kind of the same regardless of what's going on. There's just different factors that cause you to either put microphones closer or further away from each other. Perfect illustration is like the first Edgar and Chris duo record was done in Edgar's music room at his house.
Right.
And we're all sitting in the same space. I was on headphones to record that record. And just because of the room and where we were, we had to close mic a little more just to keep the signature of the room down as much as we could, to the point where Chris was sitting ended up where we had put him was with his back against a bookcase. And I'd put a music stand and a blanket, a moving blanket, on the top of the bookcase and use the music stand to either fan it out, the edge of it out over the top of him. And we found that stopped the pick stroke sound in the room. You would hear less clicking in the room. And that worked. It was like mechanical EQ. And I love that kind of thing too. Mechanical EQ is cool. You can accomplish something hanging a blanket over somebody's head to stop a clicking sound of the pick on his strings is like brilliant. I love that.
That's great. Well, it's the element of all of this is a lot of it. And I presume this is the same building yachts and it's the same building instruments. This is a great deal of problem solving. And the rooms change the problem and there's so many moving parts that the problem is always a different problem.
Yeah. My best friend Dave Pomeroy calls me Solution Man sometimes. For a long time, that was my nickname. Yeah, it is. It's a lot about that, and it's about knowing a lot of different kinds of things. A lot of what I learned building racing yachts translated into building instruments, because they're the same. It's an odd structure and tension. Like to calculate the internal volume of a musical instrument is exactly the same math as displacement on a yacht. Exactly the same. It's an odd shape, and calculating the volume of an odd shape is the same. I'm not saying I do math all the time, but it's just kind of ironic that how similar those things are. And then coming into the building instruments and then actually working on music is they're highly related, of course. But I was here in Nashville trying to build mandolins. I brought my mandolin shop to Nashville. And at that time, that was 85, F5 mandolins were going for like under $5,000. And they take a lot of time to build. It's like not a way to make a living. And I ended up, this changeover happened for me by I did a lot of, not a lot, but studio finish outs. Several small studios that I helped people build stuff on it because I had lots of tools and could make anything really. And then I ended up staying at one of them and working there and got into the Nashville demo world of making demo songs, where there's a huge industry in this town of making demos. And then I stayed there and met people until I got asked to do a session over at Sound Emporium Studio, and I loved it there. And I was out with Don Williams at that time, and whenever I wasn't out with Don, I started hanging out at Sound Emporium Studio, and I ended up being head engineer there, from hanging around fixing things and not getting paid. So I mean, that's like a big changeover part. I want to backtrack to the Chris and Edgar duo records, because the second one is so different from the first one. We recorded it at Skywalker Sound out in California, George Lucas's studio, which is this giant scoring stage with convoluted walls where you could make it more or less reverby. It was probably the best natural reverb sound room I've ever been in.
No way.
And the microphones on the same two instruments. Actually, it was not the exact same mandolin, because Chris was playing a Dudenbostel on the first one, and then he was playing a lower on the second one. But the microphone on the mandolin was easily 5 feet away from the mandolin in that room, because the interference from the room itself was so low that I could move the microphone that far back and really capture the full sound of it at a proper distance from it, so there weren't weird anomalies like pick stroke sounds that you had. That on the other one we had to hang a blanket over him to stop. And it's like, I love the sound of the mandolin on the bass and mandolin record, but super different. The reverb on that second one is all natural.
I remember I interviewed Gabe Witcher just after he left Punch Brothers, and we would talk about recording at one point, and he was saying that one of the hardest things to do is to record a mandolin player who is singing at the same time, because the things you need to make one sound good are not the things you need to make the other sound good.
Yeah. And the vocal mics getting off axis stuff into it, where the frequency response is like really bad. This is true. Although I think it's harder with acoustic guitar and singing, because the guitar is a lot closer to the vocal mic and vice versa. Whereas with a mandolin, it's actually lower, and the person is singing out over the top of the mandolin mic, which is down lower. So I think it's actually less hard with a mandolin, but it's no less true. I think what Gabe said is obviously right. The last Punch Brothers record was a Shure SM7. It's like every podcaster's microphone these days, and a Coles ribbon, 2 mics. That's it.
Wow. It's a great sounding record.
That worked. It worked great. That's another one at a different studio here in town at Blackbird.
And you were talking about recording part of Short Trip, not short, part of Uncommon Ritual was recorded in a chapel in Nashville. And I remember I read something or heard something at some point, and you were talking about that being like a steam heated room and having to turn the heating off like half an hour before you could do anything in the room.
Right. So it would stop creaking. Yeah. Yeah, we definitely did that. And then we would record until it got too chilly and we had to warm it back up again. That was St. Bernard Academy Chapel is where that was. Yeah. And I was in a closet monitoring on a little Neve line mixer with rotary pots, not even faders. It's on headphones in a closet for that one. Can't believe I did that.
If you go to a new room like that, particularly a room that you maybe sense is going to be challenging, how much gear do you take with you in terms of microphones and stuff? Do you have things you just know are going to work, or do you just take everything and see?
For me, it's all the same thing. You take everything that, my whole collection of microphones is about having mics that work in certain situations, and I know what situations they work. So that would be the go-to, a certain mic would be a go-to for a very live situation where I know it rejects a lot of stuff bouncing back in the mic, or who knows, I might not pick a ribbon mic for a certain situation because it's picking up not the backside equally out phase with the front. And depending on what the backside is pointing at, you might not want that. So yeah, I mean, having the St. Bernard Academy, I had to take all the mics. There was nothing there. It was like a school board, a Catholic school chapel. So all the mic stands, all the cabling, the recorder. Thankfully, I didn't need monitor system for them because they played acoustically in the room, listening to each other. But yeah, that chapel had a really great sound. You could hear the slap back in it on some of those tracks on Uncommon Ritual. That, like, I think on the title track actually, it that was in there, and you can hear it where it goes. This delay coming back, and it was like perfectly timed for the tempo of that track. Who could predict that?
Yeah. No, it's funny. The idea of different rooms working for different songs, and it's fascinating.
That's twice that's come up already.
Yeah, it's just something I hadn't even considered. And of course, it would make sense that maybe faster, more intricate, busier songs might work better in a small room, and more expansive stuff would work in a bigger room. Of course, it makes sense, but I hadn't considered that you might record different songs on the same record in different spaces.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't happen very often, really, because usually, a project goes into a studio or into a room, and you do all of it there. Yeah. So it's interesting that on that particular record of all of them was from two different spaces. Kind of wild. Trying to think if there's others that I did that were that way. And I can't think of any right off the top of my head.
I talked to Mike Marshall last year. It was 20th anniversary of Into the Cauldron, the record he made with Chris Thiele. And he was saying that was basically recorded in his garage, but then he took the recordings and some huge speakers and put the speakers up in a church, played it out of them, and captured that, and that's the reverb, is the church sort of mixed in. I love that.
Yeah, me too. I was around when that was happening, and actually talked to Mike about doing that, and have done that a few times myself on different things. But like, why not? It's just a chamber then.
Well, I mean, this is what people used back in the day, right? You listen to Buddy Holly records, you're hearing the sound of a mic at one end of a room and a speaker at the other.
Oh yeah, Sound Emporium Studio had two really nice chambers that made it on lots of records. They were vertical chambers, about 35 feet tall. So it was like a 8 by 8 by 35 room standing on its small end.
And is that because of the way sound travels, or just in terms of using the space?
Oh, I think they wanted a long sound. In the ones at Sound Emporium, one wall was like maybe a 3-foot zigzag, 3 feet deep, all the way up to the top on one side. And the room itself was trapezoid shaped. So it had one narrow wall and one wide wall. The top and bottom were both flat, as I recall. But that chamber only got used on ballads because it's so long. The first note you play is still going on when you hit the second one, and it can get confusing sounding, which is like why even in every mix, you start listening to up-tempo songs, you don't hear a long reverb usually. You might hear delays. Delays are fine because you can hear it's a defined thing. It's not that as diffuse as a reverb. But tempo-based effects has been a thing forever in mixing, like always.
I was interested in that because like you talked to the top about liking to think of the phrase as being a recordist, and like for people, obviously in the recording process, there's an engineer, and then somebody mixes a record, and then somebody masters a record. And I think most of us understand what the first two bits of that are. And a lot of people don't really understand what mastering does to a record.
Yeah. Meaning that people do kind of understand the mixing part, at least what goes on there, where you have the separate tracks and they're all being recombined into a mix.
Yeah.
Now, mastering, and I've done some pseudo mastering for people and kind of budget mastering, but a real mastering engineer is like having a third party check your math, where he's got a finely tuned and calibrated monitoring system that he knows what's going on. He can listen to your mix and then make judgments about it. And with artist permission, he will either EQ or compress the final mix into the form that it goes on the well, these days gets put out digitally, because CDs are going away too, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is that a decent explanation of mastering? Would there be more that?
Well, I'm just interested because it feels like there is also, and I might be wrong about this, but it feels like that's the point in the process where, like the perceived loudness of stuff can be treated. And there was a point where music just got louder and louder and louder, and the dynamic range of stuff was sort of compressed a bit. And
yeah, I lived through that in the 90s in country music world, where people were making mastering engineers, no names, would tend to fill up all of the usable space with audio and sacrificing musical dynamics for loudness, which I object to strenuously. I hate that. It's like, there's situations where it might call for narrowing that dynamic, because certain musical pieces have like classical music has a very wide dynamic, and you start playing that in your car and you're going to lose half of it. Or you turn it up so loud that you hear the soft stuff when the symphony peaks, you're it's like blowing the windows out, you know? And the whole idea of loudness in mastering is to bring up those low places relative to the loud places and narrowing that dynamic. Now, I don't like making records too loud anymore. Thank God for YouTube and iTunes, where they're finally now setting standards of how loud things get. And if people make records that are too loud and send them those places, they get turned down. I don't mean like turned away, but they get, the volume of them gets turned down. So it gives them, there's no advantage to making a really loud record these days, I don't think.
And it's,
just an opinion.
Well, and it's interesting. I think part of the reason I love acoustic music is, like string band stuff, is there's not only like there's space and there's breath and but it's not, you hear it from listening to, I don't know, Miles Davis kind of blue. You hear the instruments and it's a beautiful sound, but you hear the space between them. But it's also true of like some 60s and 70s recordings where the individual sounds aren't enormous. Like, one of my favourites is Fairport Convention Legion Leaf, which has like a fairly dead drum sound, a fairly tinny guitar, but it's a beautiful record in every way. But you hear the interplay between stuff. It's like listening to a string quartet, or you can hear how the sound is passed between the instruments, and you can lose that sometimes when stuff is just designed to blare out a wall of sound at you, however great that can sound, and that's thrilling in its own way. But I like to hear those spaces.
Oh yeah, me too. I'm right there with you. I mean, there's still stuff that highly compressed records that get mixed these days, and some of that is fine. I mean, it's like it's just a different style of things. It's like what's better, a cartoon with hard black lines around the edges of bright primary colors, or a photorealistic sketch? They're both kind of cool in a way. They have their place. I think I share that with you about, I want to hear space. I want to hear what I call the back wall in a mix. And I love being able to hear that in the space between instruments. That's one of my great pleasures. And more, I've obviously kind of specialized in acoustic music now. And I get a lot of work in from people that have been listening to Punch Brothers, for instance, and have been affected by that, and been affected by a lot of records that I've actually mixed, which is like, that's a real sobering thought. And it's nice too. It's a very pleasant feeling to go like, wow, affected a lot of people and the music that they like to listen to.
Well, in turn, when I interviewed Paul Coet, he was talking about how important a record Uncommon Ritual was for him. So it's like, those things just get passed on, don't they? And people get influenced and take it somewhere else. And, now you've got people like, I don't know, Wes Corbett, whoever, doing the things that he does that are influenced by all of that as well. And
you're talking about my family. I mean, seriously. Yeah. Paul and I were listening to Stevie Wonder day before yesterday in the car, songbook. And just, wow, what a great record that is. If you haven't heard that recently, you should check it out again.
And again, it's one of those records where, like, it couldn't sound any fuller and more engaging, but you can hear the space. Like, it's not, you can hear what everything's doing.
Oh yeah. Oh, and there's places on that record where it's kind of gets intentionally muddled, which is I think that's okay too. That's kind of fun, where it you can hear it getting loud and nasty in the space because that's what it did.
Yeah.
Capturing is a good term. I like that a lot these days. I refer to capturing performance is like really my favorite kind of recording to do, as opposed to like creating something from scratch and isolating and overdubbing and building a track, which is all fine, good work, but like capturing a really great musical performance is great. Really fun.
I think that's why, much as like I'd love Beatles albums like Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper, like I love Please Please Me, because you can just hear that it's a bunch of kids who went into a room for an afternoon. That's what they sounded like. Like you've got an afternoon of some young men on tape doing what they did. And it's just thrilling,
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I've enjoyed this hugely. It's been a treat to talk to you.
My pleasure.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.